The alarm cut through the base before I had even finished my morning report, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved. That silence was the last quiet moment we would get for hours. My name does not matter to you, but I will tell you what I am. I am a Varan, 3rd rank, assigned to Outpost Delkir, a joint research and defense station shared by 6 species at the edge of contested space. We built this place to watch a border nobody trusted. We filled it with the sharpest minds our worlds could offer. Engineers, strategists, diplomats. All of them loud, all of them certain. All of them ready to defend their opinion the way other creatures defend their young. Except one. His name was Cade Wren, the only human on the station, assigned to systems maintenance, a role most of the senior staff considered beneath serious discussion. He fixed cables. He recalibrated sensors. He sat in the back of every council meeting with a data pad on his knee, and said nothing, no matter how heated the room became. I used to think he simply had nothing to offer. That morning, the alarm was not a drill. Every screen on the eastern wall of the command deck lit up with the same warning in 6 different alien scripts. Unknown vessel, unclassified signature, closing at speed. The command hall filled within minutes. Officers from every species arrived shouting over each other before they even reached their seats, because that is how we solved problems, by putting every opinion into the air at once and letting the loudest, sharpest argument win. Commander Yisa Torel, the station's ranking officer, stood at the center console with her arms folded, waiting for the noise to organize itself into something useful. It did not. A Draveth tactician named Orlin Beth insisted the signature matched a known scouting pattern from the border conflict 2 cycles ago, and that we should power up every defense turret before the vessel came within firing range. A Sanaki analyst named Priya Solt disagreed loudly, arguing that arming the turrets first would provoke exactly the kind of attack we were trying to avoid, and that we should attempt contact instead. A 3rd officer, a broad Kethrani engineer named Dorn Vask, shouted that both of them were wrong, that the signature did not match anything in the records at all, and that we were wasting time arguing about categories instead of asking what the thing actually was. Within 4 minutes we had at least 7 competing theories, 5 proposed responses, and not a single agreed plan. This was normal for us. On every world I have ever visited, decisions are made by argument. You state your case, someone challenges it, you defend it harder, and eventually the strongest position survives. It had worked for centuries. It had built our fleets and our treaties and our sciences. It was not working now. While the command hall roared, I noticed that Cade had not said a word. He stood near the back wall by the environmental controls, arms loose at his sides, watching the argument the way someone watches weather they cannot change. I remember thinking, not without some unkindness, that this was simply what humans did. They stayed quiet, because they had little to contribute to a room full of trained strategists. I would remember that thought later with some shame. The unknown vessel closed another 12,000 kilometers while we argued about what to call it. Commander Terrell finally raised a hand for silence, and for a moment the room settled enough for her voice to carry. "We need 1 recommendation," she said, "not 5, 1. That should have ended the disagreement. It did not. Orlin Beth restated his case for immediate defense measures, louder this time, as though volume alone might change the commander's mind. Priya Solt restated her case for contact, equally loud, cutting across him. Dorn Vask kept insisting nobody had actually confirmed what the vessel was, and that every proposal on the table was built on a guess. The screens along the eastern wall flickered. At first I assumed it was simple interference from the approaching vessel, the kind of static disruption that happens when an unfamiliar signal brushes against our sensor arrays. Then the flicker became a pattern, and the pattern became something worse. Every readout on the command deck began showing different numbers. The vessel's speed on one screen did not match its speed on another. Its size estimate doubled on a third display and shrank on a fourth. Even the station's internal diagnostics, usually the most stable information we had, began contradicting themselves from one panel to the next. Someone near the front shouted that we were being hacked. Someone else shouted that it was sensor failure, not an attack. A third voice insisted the vessel itself was somehow projecting false data directly into our systems, though nobody could explain how that was possible with technology we understood. The arguing did not stop. If anything, it grew sharper, because now there was real fear underneath it, and fear has a way of making every voice louder and every position more rigid. I found myself shouting too, adding my own theory to the pile, because that is what a Varan does when frightened. We argue harder. We had never questioned whether that instinct served us well until this exact moment, when it clearly did not. Cade Wren had not moved from the back wall. I noticed him again only because, in the middle of the chaos, he stepped away from the environmental panel and walked, unhurried, toward a smaller terminal near the corner of the room. It was not a command station. It was a maintenance interface, the kind of screen only technicians ever touched, used for calibrating the sensor grid rather than reading its output. Nobody paid him any attention. Why would they? The room was busy fighting over strategy while a man they considered a simple mechanic quietly typed something into a console meant for wiring diagrams. I watched him because I was standing closest, and because some old habit of curiosity in me wanted to know what a human found worth doing while everyone else was busy shouting. He was not looking at the false readouts on the main screens at all. He had pulled up something else entirely, a raw feed from the original sensor array before it passed through any of the station's interpretation software, the layer of processing that translated raw signal into the numbers we were all arguing about. I understood, slowly, what he had realized before any of us. The problem was never the vessel. The problem was our own interpretation layer. Something in the way our systems processed incoming data had been corrupted or confused. And every argument in that room, every impassioned defense mounted by 7 skilled officers, had been built entirely on numbers that were already broken before they reached the screen. We had spent almost 20 minutes debating conclusions drawn from evidence that was never true to begin with. Cade did not announce this. He did not raise his voice to correct the room. He simply kept working at the small terminal, isolating the raw feed, running it through a secondary calibration he must have built or adjusted himself at some point during his long, quiet hours of maintenance work that nobody in that hall had ever bothered to ask him about. The vessel closed another 8,000 kilometers. Commander Terrell called for quiet again, this time with real authority in her voice, because the fear in the room had reached the point where even our instinct for argument was starting to break down into simple panic. For a moment the hall actually listened. "We are out of time to guess," she said. "Someone give me something solid, or we default to the worst case, and power every weapon this station has." That was when Cade walked forward. He did not push through the crowd or demand attention. He simply moved to the base of the central display, the one every species in that room had been staring at and arguing over for the better part of half an hour, and he reached up and shut it off. The main screen went dark. For a heartbeat, the room stopped entirely, not because anyone recognized what he had done, but because the sudden blankness where all our shouting had been aimed felt like losing the ground under our feet. Then Cade activated the display again, but this time it did not show the fractured, contradictory numbers we had all been arguing over. It showed a single clean readout, the true trajectory and size of the approaching vessel, pulled directly from the uncorrupted raw feed he had spent the last several minutes isolating. The vessel was not a warship. It was smaller than any of our estimates, moving on a decelerating course, its trajectory consistent with a ship in distress rather than one preparing to attack. A weak, intermittent signal buried under the noise resolved, for the first time, into something recognizable, a distress code, old and battered, from a civilian vessel that had clearly been drifting for some time before it ever came near our border. Nobody in that room said a word for several seconds. I have argued in council halls my entire career. I have watched officers raise their voices until the walls seemed to shake with the weight of competing certainty. I had never once seen an entire command deck go silent because of a single unadorned readout on a screen, put there by a man who had not spoken once during the whole crisis. Commander Terrell was the first to break the silence. She stepped closer to the display, studied the numbers, and turned to Cade. "How long have you had this?" she asked, and there was no accusation in it, only something close to disbelief. "About 6 minutes," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, the same tone he used when reporting a routine cable repair. The interpretation layer was corrupted somewhere upstream. "I don't know why yet. I just knew the raw feed underneath it wasn't lying, so I went to the source instead of arguing about the copy." Orlin Beth, who had spent 20 minutes insisting on an immediate defensive posture, looked at the screen and then at Cade, and for once had nothing to say. Priya Solt recovered first among the officers. She asked whether the distress signal could be verified further, and Cade nodded, already pulling up a secondary confirmation from the station's older long-range array, one that had not been affected by whatever corruption had crept into the primary system. The signal matched. The vessel was exactly what the raw data suggested. A small transport, badly damaged, crewed by survivors who had likely given up hope of anyone finding them out here at all. Commander Terrell gave the order to power down the defense turrets and prepare a rescue team instead. It took less than a minute to reach that decision, once we finally had a single truth to build it on instead of 7 competing guesses. I stayed near the back of the hall as the room emptied out into action, technicians rushing to prep a shuttle, medics gathering supplies, officers coordinating a proper approach so the frightened survivors on that battered little ship would not mistake our arrival for another threat. In the middle of all that motion, Cade returned to his maintenance terminal as if nothing unusual had happened at all, quietly documenting what he had found so the corrupted interpretation layer could be repaired before it caused a problem again. I walked over to him, because something in me needed to ask the question that had been building since the moment the main screen went dark. "You never argue," I said. "Not once. In all the meetings I have watched you sit through. Why?" He looked up from the terminal, and there was no pride in his expression, no satisfaction at having proven an entire command hall wrong. If anything, he looked a little tired. "Where I come from, we used to think the same way you do here," he said. "Loudest voice wins. Sharpest argument wins. It cost us a lot before we learned better. Somewhere along the way, enough of us figured out that being right and being loud are not the same thing, and that the two can pull in opposite directions if you are not careful. But you never even offered an opinion," I said. "Not a single time." "I did not have one worth shouting yet," he said. "Everyone in that room was arguing about who was right, before anyone checked whether the information they were arguing over was true. I figured someone should check that part first. Today it turned out to matter." I sat with that for a long moment. On my world, silence in a debate is often read as weakness, as a lack of conviction, as someone with nothing valuable to say. I had assumed the same of Cade since the day he arrived on this station. I had been wrong in a way that could have cost lives, had he not quietly done the work the rest of us were too busy arguing to do. Word of what happened spread through the station within hours, not as a dramatic story but as a simple, uncomfortable fact repeated in mess halls and corridors. An entire command deck of experienced officers, representing 6 different species, had been silenced by one unarmed technician and a single honest readout. I do not think anyone on that base saw humans quite the same way afterward. It was not fear exactly, though there was some of that mixed in. It was something closer to caution, the kind you develop towards something you underestimated for too long. The quiet ones, we learned, were not quiet because they had nothing to say. Some of them were simply listening, watching, and working, while everyone else spent their energy proving a point. Later that day I watched the rescue shuttle return with the survivors from the drifting transport, 5 exhausted crew members who had spent weeks assuming no one was coming for them. They were met not by turrets or a defensive posture, but by medics and warm shelter, because one man had trusted a raw signal over the noise of an entire room. Commander Terrell called a smaller meeting that evening, just the senior staff, to review what had happened and how the interpretation layer had become corrupted in the first place. It turned out to be a simple flaw, an outdated calibration routine that none of the station's official engineers had thought to check in years. Buried under layers of more advanced systems everyone assumed were reliable simply because they were newer. Cade had found it not because he was smarter than every officer in that room, but because he had spent months quietly maintaining the parts of the station nobody else bothered to look at closely, the boring, unglamorous systems that kept everything else running. While the rest of us debated grand strategy, he had learned the station from the inside out, one unremarkable repair at a time. Orlin Beth, to his credit, was the one who suggested afterward that maintenance staff be given a permanent seat at the strategy table, not to replace argument, but to ground it. Priya Solt agreed, adding that perhaps the real failure that morning had not been the corrupted data at all, but the fact that a room full of experts had spent 20 minutes shouting before anyone thought to ask whether their information was even true. I found Cade again near the end of that long day, back at his usual post, running a diagnostic on the same terminal that had changed everything. I asked him if he felt any different now, knowing that half the station was talking about what he had done. He shrugged, the same easy motion I had seen from him 100 times before, the gesture of someone who did not need the room's approval to know his own worth. "I did my job," he said, "same as always. I just did it a little louder this time, in the only way that mattered." I did not fully understand what he meant until much later, replaying the events of that day in my own mind. He had not raised his voice once. He had not needed to. The loudest thing in that entire crisis had been a single silent screen, showing nothing but the truth, in a room that had almost drowned it out entirely. I think of that moment often now, whenever a new crisis brings the old instinct rushing back, the urge to argue harder, faster, louder than the person beside me. I think of Cade Wren standing quietly at the back of the hall while an entire command deck fought over guesses, and I think of the 6 minutes he spent finding the one thing worth saying instead of adding his voice to the noise. We built our worlds on argument, certain that the sharpest debate would always lead us to the truth. It took one silent human and one honest screen to teach an entire station that sometimes the truth is not won through argument at all. Sometimes it is simply found, quietly, by the one person willing to stop shouting long enough to look.